Lost in all of the Kevin Durant drama and whether or not Kyrie Irving was going to be back with the team, we may have tended to overlook one of the Nets' biggest offseason moves, maybe one of the best moves made in the entire NBA when it comes to upside and price. Going to talk about all that, but first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day, even during the offseason. I am Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR.com. You know the drill. Go to DFSR.com if you're needing projections for FanDuel or DraftKings. MLB rolling through the season, NFL, they got those first slates coming up there already. Obviously NBA when we're going hot and heavy with that. So go to DFSR.com. Not here, my vaunted co-host, Adam Armbrecht. He's the voice of the One Giant podcast where he's covering the New York Football Giants. So go make sure you're checking that out leading into the season. He's off on Friday after holding it down on Thursday, talking about Kevin Durant, talking about Joe Tsai, all that stuff. We made a promise that we would not talk another day about Kevin Durant until there was more news. And then we lasted less than 24 hours with that one. And Adam had to talk about the potential meeting with Durant and Tsai, which as of I'm recording right now, it's unclear if that's happened or not. Obviously, if news breaks here on Friday, we'll jump back on, how this news cycle works. You get while the getting's good usually when it comes to podcasting stuff. But if something comes of it, we'll make sure we jump on and discuss it. For today, I wanted to shift the narrative a little bit, not the narrative so much, at least as much as the talking points, because this offseason has been so clouded by the Kevin Durant, I'm going to call it drama for lack of a better word, trade request, whatever you want to call it, and for good reason. Like when Kevin Durant, a guy of Kevin Durant's stature, talent, superstardom, with this many years in the contract, even with not, frankly, wants to or asks out from a team, you have to talk about it. It has to be the main thing you talk about. It's not doom and gloom. It's just the reality of the situation. That's huge news. It's one of the biggest pieces of news in all of the NBA. It's going to continue to stretch on through the offseason. You have to talk about it. And sometimes what happens is those other stories get put by the wayside. And was kind of just going back and thinking about the Nets offseason and how, in terms of free agency, obviously they weren't a part of the draft, but in terms of free agency, where they landed, in terms of like offseason signings, those kind of, we spent a little time on them at the time because we had to, but remember that Kevin Durant trade request piece came around the same time. We're basically at free agency. So it was the whole thing got clouded right to begin with. We threw away the Royce O'Neal piece, just because it was like, well, why even bother talking about that? We don't know what this team is going to look like. And I think for some of these players, that still rings true. I think we are in a holding pattern on the Nets as a whole when it comes to, what this team looks like for next season, because you have to. But in thinking about it, I do think there was one signing that they made, which we did talk about it briefly at the time, and we've thrown this name in there at times. But the more I thought about it, I was like, man, this actually might have been one of the sneakiest, best signings in terms of just sheer upside in the entire NBA when you factor in the cost that it took to get him, and that's TJ Warren. TJ Warren was a guy who has had like a pretty interesting career, all things considered. I'll go through some of the beats with his career so far. He's 28 years old. He's coming off having not played since 2021. I basically since the bubble, since the beginning of the 21 season, he played 4 games and then he had a foot. He kind of had like back-to-back stress fractures in his foot, which really we're going to essentially say he's missed 2 full seasons of basketball. I know that he played those four games. But when you look at what the Nets did, they signed him to a 1-year contract, $2.6 million. He's 28 years old. There's tons of risk. He's got multiple foot injuries. I get it. There's a lot of risk here. But this is sort of like harkens back to some of these signings that Sean Marks and company had made in the past, sort of taking on a player whose value was really depressed, or maybe they didn't know what a player was. We've seen so many examples of this through the Marks regime over the years. Spencer Dinwiddie. I mean, these don't fall into the TJ Warren camp here because for reasons I'm going to explain. But just if you think about it, players whose value and stock was down at the time for whatever reason, injury, wrong fit, other teams couldn't see it. And they sort of reclamated a lot of these guys. We have so many examples of this. D'Angelo Russell, a very good example of this, right? Spencer Dinwiddie, a good example. Bruce Brown, a good example. We have multiple examples of the Nets taking stabs at players who have a certain skill set, or, there's certain things they do really well, and trying to hone in on, bringing that stock back up. And by and large, the Nets have done a really good job of it. This is another one of those examples. Now, TJ Warren does not fit into the same sort of example as those previous guys because he's a little older than those guys were. He's had a little bit more of established career. This one's more about injury than it is about other teams really not being able to see what the potential is for a player. But man, go back and look at some TJ Warren stats. Go think about what this guy became and sort of what he transformed himself into when he left Phoenix. He was drafted by Phoenix. He comes out of NC State, kind of toils on the bench for a while, and then it kind of becomes like an ISO score mid-range guy for a couple of seasons. And then all of a sudden in 2018, 2019, decides that he's going to start jacking up a lot of threes. And it turns out that he's actually really good at it. So before that, his previous 2 seasons where he got real minutes on the Suns, he was 27% from three on 1.5 attempts per game, and then 22% on 1.4 attempts per game in 2017, 2018. And then all of a sudden in that next season with Phoenix, he just decides, okay, well, I'm just going to take a few more steps out here behind the 3-point line, and I'm going to start shooting threes. And all of a sudden he turns into a 43% 3-point shooter on 4.2 attempts per game, which is kind of out of nowhere. But sometimes it takes, remember, I mean, the 3-ball had pretty much been advanced at this point. It's the science is solved on whether the math is undefeated when it comes to whether you should be shooting threes or not. But it's still, even 4 or 5 years ago, not every player had totally adapted their game yet. And we see it more and more. It's coming. Most players know at this point they have to be able to do it. There's a few kind of holdouts, but even they're coming around. TJ Warren sort of fell into that camp when it came to the 3, because he just decided to start shooting it. And then he goes in sort of what ends up becoming a salary dump for the Suns because they don't want to go into the tax. He ends up going off to the Pacers, where he basically keeps up about the same volume. It was a little less, 3.4 attempts per game, but he still shot over 40% from 3. And this guy's more than just a catch and shoot 3-pointer. He can get his own shot. He's averaged 15 shots a game that in the 2019-2020 season with the Pacers, which extended into the bubble. Because if you remember the bubble, there was a couple games where he absolutely went off, like just completely off, was just absolutely torching guys. And we saw this not glimmer, but we saw this idea that TJ Warren could be like an absolute volume scorer, which, he's not going to be probably on a consistent game-to-game basis. But in the bubble, he dropped 53, then 34, then 32, took a game off with 16, and then dropped 39 on the Lakers. And that was the end of the Pacers' regular season run. They ultimately go to the playoffs. He's okay-ish in the playoffs against Miami, though the Pacers did get swept in that series. Obviously, Miami went on to the finals that year, so the Pacers never really had a chance. Though Warren, got up 17 shots per game in that playoff series, scored 20 points a game, and then basically didn't play since. That's the kind of player that you can really dream about, like getting some upside on, at least just in terms of value. Like maybe you hit on something here and he's able to round back into the player he was. Maybe you just reclamate some of his value and you're able to turn him for a trade. These are just the kinds of moves that the Nets used to really make. And they took a few seasons off, or really last season. They took last season off from it, got maybe a little cute with the roster. Went for some older guys, but like a little too old at this point. And that ended up sinking some of their chances. If you think about guys like Millsap, they obviously bring Aldridge back. He was fine when he played. Blake was just probably, done by that point. The roster just ends up becoming a little too old, not versatile enough. But TJ Warren does represent sort of a different mode of thinking, I think, for the Nets, and going back to something that they've been really good at in the past. And I'll talk a little bit about like where he compares with some of these other free agent signings and why actually he's a guy I think we can talk about independent of the Kevin Durant saga as it goes on, because I think Warren, unlike some of these other guys, is in a little bit a different mold than sort of the way the rest of the team shapes up. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online. Right now, you can still go to Bet Online, if you want to look at where the futures fall for the NBA championship, right now, Boston Celtics plus 400. I can see it. Bucks plus 550. I get it. Go down to sixth on the list. The Brooklyn Nets are there tied with the Los Angeles Lakers at plus 1,400. Again, ahead of the Heat, plus 1,600. Ahead of the Sixers at plus 1,600 too. That's what you're going to see over at Bet Online. They have all the odds, all the action you want to get into. It's not just basketball, obviously, too. They're raring for football season coming around the corner. All the sports wagering information you need. They got live in-game betting as well. Head on over. You learn about all the different trends, all of the different action. Bet Online, where the game starts. All right, so why is the TJ Warren piece a little different than some of these other guys? So the team right now is full of what ifs. It's just a totally what if scenario around every single guy. It's almost difficult in some ways to talk about the state of the Nets because we have so far from an incomplete picture on what they're going to be a day, a week, a month, many months from now, that really, unlike any other team, which during this time of the offseason, you can start having real conversations about how you see things shaking out for better or for worse. That's simply not possible with the Nets right now. There's too many moving parts. Now, maybe, like I said, Kevin Durant meets with Joe Tsai, they mend fences, and all of a sudden, things look good, and those Bet Online odds numbers kind of jump up a little bit, and this is a championship level team again. But in terms of like the holistic view of the team, you can't really take it because the simple moving of Kevin Durant on or off the team changes all of the narrative. And then, because obviously you're going to get players back, that's going to change things. If Kevin Durant sits and they don't get players back, that changes things. If he stays, then we can start talking about them in terms of like sort of how we know them, except that we've never seen them with Ben Simmons, yada, yada, yada. The list goes on. The what if train seemingly runs off to infinity when it comes to this team in a sort of unprecedented way. But I will say that TJ Warren to me feels different from this group. He feels sort of outside the what ifs. The big what if, obviously, is he going to be able to recover from the foot injury? Foot injuries are not great. They're just, you run around on your feet all day. I don't think you need to be a medical doctor for me to tell you why foot injuries are not great if you play basketball. Your feet take a pounding. Sometimes it's very difficult to recover from them. Sometimes it's okay, but sometimes there's complications. We just saw what Zion Williamson went through. Different frame, different stuff, but still, like, foot injuries can be ones that linger or crop back up, a la TJ Warren, who just went through back-to-back pieces with this. So that is a huge what if. I get it. That's built into his price, though. When you pay a guy $2.5 million in his age 28 season, when the last season he was dropping 20 points a game on 40% three-point shooting, the whole reason you get him at the discount is because of the injury. So I think in some ways I can wipe that off the slate and say that's built into his price already. The part where he might be injured, the Nets are paying very little in essence. $2 million is a lot to anybody, but in the grand scheme of the salary cap in basketball, $2 million is essentially nothing. And it's definitely nothing for a guy of this skill. And this is what I mean by it's the highest upside signing of the whole season in the whole NBA. And like I said, I don't think it's close because, it's one thing if you're 35 years old and you're really at the end of the line. 28 years old, if the foot heals, theoretically, there's still gas left in that tank. And we saw what this guy can do. And his game, in the way that it's predicated, I don't want to say it's personnel independent because it always matters who's around you on a basketball court to make you better or worse or whatever. But unlike other players that need a lot of things to fall into place for their skill set to really shine, and Nets have had examples of this, like Bruce Brown is an example of this. Like, he just needs to be on the right team. Okay. Like, Bruce Brown needs to be on the right team for it to look right, for his skills to really be utilized, needs to have a lot of offensive guys around him, needs to maybe have an undersized guard that's good on offense, or like Jokic, right, that can find cutters. That makes sense. Like, it's going to be hard to kind of put a value on him based on different teams. But TJ Warren's not like that. Like, TJ Warren is just a basketball player who knows how to score. The defense is whatever, not great, but the size is there, and he's shown the ability for long stretches in the NBA to be able to sort of even take over games. To get a guy like that at 28 years old for $2 million and change is like the no-brainer of the century. And again, I'll repeat, the foot injury stuff is built into the price, so you don't worry about it. $10 million a year with the foot injury, yeah, you're sitting around really watching TJ Warren every single time he runs up and down the court to see if the foot injury is going to crop back up at that number. Definitely. But this is what I mean by where the price is, it kind of skews the way, or not, doesn't need to skew the way we're thinking about it, because it's already there for him. They're already in a very low risk, high reward situation that you really can't say about any other signings. I had someone throw it out to me on Twitter that John Wall fit into this bill. I kind of see that just because Wall's a name. Obviously, he's had excellent seasons of his career. He's been out of the game for about as long as TJ Warren has. He's 3 years older than TJ Warren. He's also $6 million per year for 2 years with the Clippers. So the kind of the calculus changes a little bit around that one, right? So if they're just paying him, well, they're paying about 2.5 times more for this season. And then they're on the hook to pay him the other for next season if it doesn't work out. $6 million for John Wall, that could look amazing for sure. There's a very good chance that it does, especially if he's just been resting, getting himself in shape, hasn't put any miles on him over the last couple of years. But I can't think of really any other signings with a guy who has an on-court track record like TJ Warren at this age. There just wasn't any other examples of guys who have signed in this range. Like, that's just it. That seems like the whole list. And so when you're asking about the what ifs, we'll worry about his foot, but at what cost? Because here's the thing: if he's really good, the Nets obviously got something at this number that could far exceed the salary. Easily could exceed it. Probably wouldn't even need to play a whole season at very good basketball to already well exceed whatever the contract is. Maybe there's some goodwill because you signed him here and you took a chance on him when other teams didn't want to. Obviously, the $2 million plus doesn't seem like there would have been a lot of bidders for TJ Warren. Maybe you reclaim his value and you flip him for something if the whole Kevin Durant piece goes off the table. And by the way, if Kevin Durant's not back on the team, taking a high usage player off the table for the Nets only helps TJ Warren in reclaiming his value because he essentially has operated like a high usage guy in the past. Or Kevin Durant's back on the team. They're at full strength. TJ Warren, again, injury issues aside, is coming off the bench as like a microwave scorer kind of guy that can fit in with a bunch of different archetypes. Guys like Simmons, a couple of shooters around him, can play with a big. Like, he can play as a wing, an on-ball wing, in a way where, again, it's going to matter a lot less who the rest of the team is, right? Like, think about this. This is where the TJ Warren thing becomes even more important. If you at times in your career can be somewhat personnel independent around the other 4 guys on your team, where it's at least not a huge detriment to your team, that player has a ton of value, or potentially can have a ton of value. Now, does TJ Warren have other issues? Hey, we'll see. I don't know. Like, he's been out of the league 2 years. Had a couple of people saying to me on Twitter that, like, you have to watch the personality stuff. I don't know. I haven't heard too many rumblings of that throughout the years. It's not like become a main story. Maybe there's something. We'll do some more digging on that, but it's not something that came as like these huge red flags with him when he signed. So that's something that I'm just going to say, it is what it is. So anyway, I think in looking at this and thinking about this TJ Warren thing, I do feel like we probably didn't spend enough time on it at the time, mostly because he doesn't fit in with those other guys. Hey, is Joe Harris going to come back healthy? Yeah, he needs some other guys around him to get the 3-point looks to really look good. Seth Curry, and we pretty much know what he can do at this point. He is what he is. He's a really good value for the Nets. The contract's a good one. We know this. We'll see what PC ends up being. Claxton, Simmons, like, we're kind of waiting and seeing on some of these guys, specifically Simmons. He has a lot of upside. They already pay him a ton too. So it's not like, Simmons has a ton of upside on where his value has tanked to, but he still gets paid a ton. So it's not like you just have to hope that he starts playing close to what the contract already is. That's why these are different situations than where we are with TJ Warren. And I just think, the more I thought about it, I'm like, this is as long as the foot stays healthy, this is a win-win-win situation all around for the Nets, no matter what happens with Kevin Durant, no matter what happens with Kyrie Irving. All right, closing out the show here, want to get you thinking about a couple things as we go into the weekend, because we're going to spend some time on this next week in terms of like where the Nets are. Again, short of where the Kevin Durant situation lands, short of what ends up happening with all of that. A couple things. One, make sure you get questions in for a mailbag. Adam and I are going to do probably a multi-episode mailbag. Already have some good ones in. Almost did it today instead, but felt like TJ Warren, was just a guy that we could talk about here for a little while leading into the weekend. And Adam and I will definitely round back on that when it comes to next week, because we'll start fleshing out other guys on this roster that kind of where their value is independent of what happens with Kevin Durant. The other thing we're going to talk about next week, Adam and I want you to think about this because I want everyone to kind of throw their hat in the ring here, is we're going to talk about like mistakes. If we could walk back one mistake we think the Nets made over the last couple of years, like what would it be? And there's a lot, or missteps. Let's say missteps. Adam and I are going to debate this and we're going to come into where we're not going to tell each other what each of our things is, because that's just, we want to be surprised. We want to make sure that it kind of doesn't necessarily catch each person off guard, but they can react honestly in the moment about whether they're the same. And we'll just have to figure out some way to make sure we don't have the right one. But I don't think that's going to be the case. But in terms of misreads, man, I will say that the list is pretty long, and I won't put these in any kind of order because I've been mostly pretty complimentary of the way this front office has worked over the last few years. I thought in the moment, process-wise, a lot of the moves they made were mostly correct. I know people want to play revisionist history with this stuff like all the time, and it probably allows people to get skewed on what they actually thought about a deal at the time, because when it doesn't work out the way you wanted it to, it's much easier to think about something and say, we shouldn't have done it that way. I didn't want to do that at the time. And I don't know, that is really, if you can remember how things go down in the moment, that really hasn't a lot of the times been the case with Marks. Now, there have been missteps though. And there have been things that because I think we'll be able to say, we'll go back and not do revisionist history, but say, I wish this didn't happen, right? If I could pick one thing to have just gone differently. And here's the thing. It's not going to be like, I would have had the Nets win the championship. That's not a thing that didn't go differently. We're going to talk about like specific actions or decisions or just moments from the Nets, but either from the front office, on the court, with the players, that we would just change. And if we change this one thing, could that change the whole course of like the Nets last couple of years? This is not a thing you can do with every team, or at least not in the way that the Nets have this seemingly unending list of the way stuff has broken down for them over the last couple of years, because it's just crazy. It's crazy the amount of stuff that's happened. We talked about it on a previous episode about like the sheer volume of mistakes, bad luck, randomness, just oddball stuff that's happening, personalities. Just the list is so freaking long about how things have gone like off the rails at times. I do think we can probably look at a few inflection points and say, if this had gone differently, we'd be different. Now, the counter to that is to say, with a list that is so long, something would have happened with this team. That's the counter. Something would happen. Hey, you're going to list 20 things that went wrong. Great. It's not like if one of them didn't happen, the rest wouldn't happen. That's the counter to this kind of exercise, is that sometimes you're just destined to be a team that everything goes wrong for because of the personalities, because things just don't mesh, because of the circumstances at the time, that you could say, if it wasn't this, it would have been that, and away you go. And I get that. But I think it's going to be a pretty fun couple episodes because, one, like I said, the list is so long that we could probably do 10 of these in terms of how the Nets world has been rocked by just stuff over the last couple of years. And two, I just interested in being surprised by that Adam and I think about this stuff a lot differently. We just have different approaches to how we think about the game. I think that works really well for the podcast. We have different ways that we approach how teams operate and what it means to be a fan and what it means to have a podcast. They're not conflicting. They're complementary ways that we think about the team that I think ends up being really good for the podcast, but it definitely means that our answers are almost assuredly going to be different. And that's cool. And that's cool. And sometimes even with a team like the Nets, that's just dealt tons of, sort of heartbreak / being annoyed / frustration. Probably frustration is the word. We won't be want to have something like this come up on it, because there are a lot of examples. So think about that one over the next couple days. Think about what's one thing you would just have gone differently for this team, or one decision you wish the team could walk back, or if we just had the Marty McFly, Doc Brown time machine, could we go back and just change something? understanding that when you do that, you flip the way the rest of the universe is going to go, as Marvel is exploring as well. So there's lots of ways to think about this, but I think that's what we're going to do. Also, make sure you get in that mailbag, throw in some questions. Like I said, I got a couple already. Got ones about Steve Nash, got ones about some of the rest of the roster. Had a debate about where TJ Warren and Kessler Edwards, if they sort of maybe one compromises the other's development. We'll see if we can kind of get there on that. There's a bunch of stuff already waiting that we're going to end up covering. So make sure you go check that out and throw a question into YouTube. Tweet it to us. You can tweet to me at Doug Norrie or at Locked On Nets on Twitter. Those are the places you can throw in those mailbag questions. Make sure you subscribe over on Twitter as well. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. 2 totally free ways that you can help the podcast. All you got to do is just click one button, like and subscribe, and that's it. And we really appreciate the way the numbers are growing. This is what keeps us able to come at you free every single day about the Brooklyn Nets. And like I said, it's super easy for you to do. And we really appreciate it if you do as well. Adam is the one that brings us out with all the great American poets. So I will not do that today. Instead, we'll just say we'll talk to you next week when we're talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.